On this episode, I talked to Kelly about the four-part process of nonviolent communication. We talk about our feelings, our needs, and why my feet smell so bad. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
Okay.
Okay. Back up, start over.
Take two.
Got it.
Hi, Kelly.
Hey, Lucas.
So today, you and I, we're going to be talking about nonviolent communication. So I'm thinking of the different kinds of episodes that I'd like to have on the podcast. Mm-hmm. One would be talking to people who are different from me about how they're different. Another kind of podcast, kind of episode would be talking to people about things that we're not supposed to, or things that are difficult to talk about, maybe controversial topics or things that I disagree with someone about, things like that. So having conversations where I actually disagree with somebody. The last kind of episode I would like to have is the kind we're going to have today, which is talking about how we talk to each other, talking about different kinds of tools or models or ideas that are helpful in how we talk to each other, especially when it's difficult.
Yes.
So you and I have both, I think, learned a lot from nonviolent communication. And so I thought it would be fun to talk to you today about that.
Great.
So a little bit of background about nonviolent communication. It was created by a guy named Marshall Rosenberg. And he grew up in Detroit in the 40s and 50s. I gather he saw a lot of violence in Detroit in those years growing up and wanted to find ways to deal with those conflicts in a healthier way, peaceful alternatives. So he studied clinical psychology and got a doctorate in that, and then developed through his work, this process called nonviolent communication. And I really like this. I don't want to spend too much time just going through all of his history, although it is probably pretty interesting. But I really like this quote from the website that I'll include in the show notes from him, where Marshall Rosenberg said that all over the world, in every culture, people are playing one of two games. One of those games was called Who is Right and Who is Wrong. The other game is called How Can I Make Life More Wonderful? And I love that captures something really basic about life that helps you maybe think about what game you're playing in life. And so the nonviolent communication process is intended to play the second game, the how we can make life more wonderful. So I thought first it would be nice to share our stories. How did you and I, learn about nonviolent communication? How has it helped us? You feel up to going first?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
I can go first, but you're going to have to help with some of the details. As far as my introduction to nonviolent communication. So I guess just to lay the groundwork for what I maybe have learned about conflict and communication growing up and becoming an adult, I grew up in a home where there was an alcohol addiction at play. And that kind of was the central driving force of all of our family interactions. And so definitely growing up, learning and becoming very skilled at avoiding conflict, just avoiding doing anything that would disrupt the peace if that makes sense. And, but also observing that when conflict happened, it was big and it was loud and involved a lot of blaming of other people, if that makes sense. So, interestingly, so that was kind of my background. When I became an adult and I started dating my now husband, Billy, he grew up in kind of a home that was opposite of that, in that his family had very calm, very measured, very careful conversations, lots of conversations. That Billy really didn't have an experience with this kind of aggressive conflict that came very naturally to me. So whenever we started dating, and in any human relationship, you're going to have conflict, knowing having those very different backgrounds coming to the table. I know for the both of us, we kind of, we would experience and try to solve disagreement in very different ways. To the point that we wondered if it was even reconcilable. Could we actually work out if we stay together? Because our approaches to conflict were so different. So with the help of others, we managed to find some better ways to have conflict. But really what has been the game changer in not only that relationship, but all of, I would say just the vast majority of how I engage with other people, is this whole nonviolent communication process. And I don't even remember what year I learned about it, but it was through Hope Fellowship Church where, Lucas, you and I met. And I don't even know, we did a several-week teaching series. Help me fill in the details there. But we actually did a teaching series where we went through each of the steps of the process. But then we sat in the room with each other and we practiced. And did some role playing to kind of, because as we'll go through the process, some of the wording can feel cumbersome, and it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of creativity, and it does require a great deal of effort, but it is so totally worth it. And it has really helped shape just the kind of overall day-to-day life in my home with Billy and now our kids, in my larger extended family, in my relationships with my colleagues at work, pretty much everywhere. So
yeah, I'm trying to think. We may have been overseas when Hope Fellowship was doing teaching on nonviolence, which is interesting because that is the same time that we were learning about nonviolent communication in Bolivia.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I didn't realize that it was parallel. I would have assumed we were in the same space doing that. So
yeah, I think that's right. I could be totally wrong. We had 2010 moved to Bolivia to work with Mennonite Central Committee, and our kids, we had 2 kids at the time, and they were around 2 and 4 when we moved. So we were relatively new parents. And I remember when we finally moved to the house that we were going to be living in was when I really noticed Asher, our oldest child, having a lot of emotions. And at the time, I didn't know what to do with it, really. I don't feel like I had the tools, and I responded the best that I could at the time, trying to control his behavior, trying to, he had glasses and he was a little kid with glasses, so he broke his glasses all the time, and it would make me so angry. And I would put him in his room, I would yell at him sometimes, and I just would get so frustrated trying to figure out how to deal with his emotions, because he was upset, he would be yelling. I couldn't make him stop doing certain things, or I couldn't get him to listen to me. He's 4 years old.
Right.
But I struggled so much. I'm really thankful that Mennonite Central Committee here in Bolivia has a library of books that are for service workers. Since many of those service workers come from Canada and the United States, there's a lot of books in English. And one of those books was Respectful Parents, Respectful Kids, which is based on Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. My wife is the one who read the book. And I remember her saying to me, you really need to read this book. I think it would help you a lot. As a perfectionist. My personality, I tend to think I'm right about most things and know the answers, don't always respond well to criticism. So this is my future self, more self-aware self reflecting back. So at the time I was kind of like, okay, I'll get around to it. Maybe it could help, but really, we just need to do something to control him or get him to listen to us, get him to do what we want him to do, basically. And if that meant yelling at him and scaring him, then maybe that's what would work, right? Because we've got to get him to listen. Eventually, I did read the book, Respectful Parents, Respectful Kids. It was maybe one of the most difficult books that I've read, because here I was trying to figure out how to parent this child that I loved, but that I was also very, very frustrated with and didn't know how to handle. And this book is touching some nerves in my life that maybe I hadn't dealt with yet, with anger and asking me to really wrestle with things that I had not wrestled with at that point, I think, in my life. And one of the central things that is part of the nonviolent communication process is this idea that the behaviors that we see, whether it's in our children or in other people, are only the symptoms. I think that was one of the things that helped me the most in changing how I saw things, how I saw Asher's behavior, was realizing the behavior was the symptom, and what I needed to do was try and understand what the need was behind the symptom. For me, that was huge. That small realization, but just trying to understand that what I saw, controlling the behavior, was not going to work for what I wanted.
Our poor first children. I mean, they're the great experiment, I guess.
No, it is so true. It is so true. And just like I want my children to have grace for me, I try to remember to have grace for my parents. And as you were saying about what we were given growing up about conflict, we were all given the best that our parents could do. And sometimes our parents have diseases like alcoholism or other problems, or they are doing the best with what their parents gave them.
Right.
And we try to recognize that. And at the same time say, well, what can I learn to do better now? Try to continue building on what they gave me and learn more and help my children do better. Of course, we all give our kids some kind of dysfunction, right?
Well, sadly, yes.
we don't want to admit it, I think, or say it, but it's true, yeah.
No, absolutely.
And maybe the best thing to do is at least admit it, right? That was the other thing, I think, for me, as I was struggling with that time in Bolivia and just learning about nonviolent communication. What I'm now learning even more about this idea of rupture and repair, that in our relationships, conflict is normal. Conflict is part of being in relationship with people. Conflict causes ruptures. But the important part is the repair and how you repair that relationship. And for me, beginning way back with my relationship with my wife, I have always had a hard time saying, I'm sorry, and admitting that I'm wrong about anything. That was another thing that I remember clearly struggling with, learning to say sorry to my kids to try and repair that relationship. That I was going to screw up, I was going to make mistakes, but to be able to go to them and say, I shouldn't have yelled, I'm sorry, and try to repair that relationship. Yeah, I don't know if any of that brings up any other thoughts or stories about as you were learning nonviolent communication.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's, I think it's just easier to think of examples, and who do you spend the most time with? My husband and my two kids. Having the humility to acknowledge, when you've caused harm and you've caused hurt, or you've made an error in judgment and you've, done something. And then I think this goes hand in hand with this whole conversation, is to, when I go to my kids and I say, hey, I did this thing and I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry, and giving and asking them, will you forgive?